I'm George Galloway.
And I'm Adam Gary.
Together, we are the History Boys. Every week, we take you back into history to understand what happened and what it meant for us now. Because, as I always say, if you don't understand how you got here, you'll never work out how you go forward. Marx said that history repeats itself, the first time as tragedy, the second time as farce. Actually, the subject we're discussing tonight has repeated itself so often that it's both tragedy and farce in equal measure. I refer to the role of the false flag in history. Now, don't reach for your tinfoil hat. Not everything is a false flag, but just because not everything is a false flag, that doesn't mean that nothing is. A very good example has now burst on the scenes, or would do if it were not for the Brexit distraction. I refer, of course, to the British government being caught red-handed, if that's not an inappropriate metaphor, in funding a charity, non-for-profit, not-profit organisation, which was using government funds to, amongst other things, smear the opposition in Parliament and its leader, Jeremy Corbyn. Doesn't get much more serious than that, Adam. It's not so much a false flag as a flag that's been revealed. But we'll come back to that, because historically, there have always been false flags, haven't there?
There certainly have, and there's a quote that's generally attributed to the German philosopher Arthur Schopenhauer, which says all ideas go through three stages. First, they are ignored, then they are mercilessly ridiculed, and finally, they are accepted as absolute truth. And the same applies to many of these political false flags that we're going to discuss. And I think our journey should begin in the year 1894, where the first ultra-modern style political false flag was flown in France. I'm talking, of course, about the infamous Dreyfus affair.
Yes.
Now, this was about a man called Alfred Dreyfus, a Jewish man, a French citizen from the Alsace region of France, where people have a lot of Franco-German background. That's a well-known fact, and because of the prevailing anti-Semitism in certain circles in France at the time, Dreyfus was accused of giving state military secrets to the Germans. I don't know if I mentioned it, but he was a military officer of some substantial standing. Now, to contextualize this for people who might be more familiar with 20th century history, in the late 19th century, apart from Ottoman Turkey, which has had a long record of being very hospitable towards Jews, in Europe itself, Germany was probably the best place, along with maybe the Netherlands, to be a Jew.
Germany was the least anti-Semitic place in Europe in the late 19th century.
Which is indeed...
And look what happened just decades later.
Indeed, it's one of the reasons that the events of the 1930s and 40s in Germany are so shocking, because it literally went from white to black. Yep. In France, things were a bit touchy. Jews did have full civic rights, but there was an anti-Semitic movement that was gathering steam at this time. Dreyfus was found guilty of a crime that was totally non-existent. The charges weren't innuendo, they weren't a half-truth, they were 100% fabricated, and yet he was condemned as a traitor and sent to the infamous French penal colony at Devil's Island. But that isn't where the story ends. A journalist and novelist, Emile Zola, led a group of people that were campaigning for Dreyfus's innocence. A far bigger group, for example, than is campaigning for Julian Assange's innocence today.
Good point.
Let's not mock the past all that much. Some things were worse, but some things were clearly better. Zola famously penned an editorial called J'accuse, I accuse, which, if you substitute the proper noun of Dreyfus and the France of the late 19th century for just about any of these other issues, which we'll get to, the argument that Zola makes really does apply. So whenever we hear these false flags, the term J'accuse should indeed ring in people's ears. He was then tried himself, Zola that is, for libeling the French president. So he ran away to England for a year and the French government collapsed. Then he went back. Ultimately, Dreyfus remained imprisoned until 1906,
Wow.
when he was finally pardoned.
On Devil's Island or in a slightly better billet?
I do believe that he was transferred at one point in that time frame as he faced multiple trials. They kept on throwing more charges at him. But one of the more interesting elements to this story is the epilogue, which gets very little discussion time pointed to it. And this is that after he was released in 1906, he went on to serve very honorably and was highly decorated for serving in the French military during the First World War. So in a weird way, not that the First World War could be described as a happy ending in any stretch of the imagination, but in the sense that he was fully rehabilitated by the end of his life and even became a kind of French hero, does show that things really went from black to white for Dreyfus himself. He was exonerated in his own lifetime, which is more than we can say about a lot of people who have been tarred with the false flags of political excoriation.
Let's hope Julian Assange has an equally happy ending, but without having to go and fight in a world war in order to be so. So the Dreyfus affair has become quite famous. I mean, you even get taught it in history in this country, and I expect that it's bigger in France. Not the first false flag, but a good one to start with. Take us now into the 20th century, so far as false flags are concerned.
Well, in the 20th century, we begin our story in Britain, where in 1923, the Labour Party formed a minority government after the Liberals refused to give their backing to a plurality of Conservative MPs under the leadership of one of the more interesting figures of the 20th century, Stanley Baldwin. So the first Labour government under Ramsay MacDonald came in 1923, but because Parliament was frankly a bit more honest then than it is now, minority governments relying on the goodwill of another party didn't last as long as they do today. I say with
because
a bit of irony.
They don't pork barrel then as they do now. The DUP may or may not remain loyal in exchange for the £1.5 billion they were dealt by the current Conservative government at the time of recording.
Indeed. Who knows what's going to happen once the viewers actually see this. But so MacDonald couldn't really govern effectively, and so he called another election in 1924. Now, the prospect of a Labour government forming a majority government would have been incredibly frightening to the elites. It was...
Just remind the viewers, though, women could not vote in that election in 1924. Some of property could, but all
Indeed.
women could not vote until 1929.
Indeed, the 1929 so-called flapper election was the first time that universal male and female suffrage on a purely universal franchise was enacted. So although some women got the right to vote after 1918, all women didn't get the right to vote until later. So that's an important aspect of that election. So we've got the 1924 general election, and the Daily Mail, owned by Lord Rothermere, as I believe it still is today owned by the descendants of the then Lord Rothermere, they published a letter which was purportedly from Grigory Zinoviev, who was the leader of the Comintern, the Communist Internationale. In that letter, the Soviet Union was talking about the influence it had over British leftist organizations, including the Communist Party of Great Britain, which meant something very different in the 20s than it means today. And by implication, the Labour movement and the Labour Party itself was implicated as having Soviet ties. As a result of this letter, which was published just in very close proximity to the election date, Labour lost the election, Stanley Baldwin forms a government, and Labour's reputation, at least in some quarters, became incredibly tarred. Now, Zinoviev denied having anything to do with this document at the time. He made his denial prior to the general election. The Labour Party totally renounced the very idea that such a letter existed. existed, but the power of the press at the time, which which clung on to this like a piranha fish on a man's limb, just wouldn't let go. The red blood of Labour was spilt, and that was certainly one of the reasons why they lost the election to a fairly internally divided Conservative Party.
Now, it's accepted by MI6 in its official history that the Zinoviev letter was a forgery. Naturally, the official historian wants to put the blame on White Russian circles, but can't exculpate the service from involvement in it, because it was the head of MI6 who handed the letter to the Daily Mail. That cannot now be gainsaid. In other words, MI6's official position is that they were hoodwinked by White Russian emigres.
And they're supposed to be the intelligence community.
Intelligence service. And of course, instead of giving it to the Prime Minister of the day, Ramsay MacDonald, they gave it to the Daily Mail in order to bring down Ramsay MacDonald. I can tell you, as someone who spent my whole life in the Labour movement, the words Zinoviev letter have never died in our collective consciousness, our political cultural consciousness. It is and has become a byword for false flag, fake accusations at strategically important moments, and it doesn't really even matter much if they're quite quickly debunked, as long as they're not debunked until after the desired result has been achieved, as happened in this case.
Absolutely. And one of the things that seems to have come out of this is that many people, not just in the UK Labour Party, but in groups throughout the world that are subject to these kinds of false allegations from the establishment, they almost go out of their way to disassociate themselves from that with which they were never associated, which frankly beggars belief. If the truth isn't a good enough position to stake one's claim on, I don't know what is, but there's this sort of reaction.
Could the Zinoviev letter have worked in today's social media culture? I suspect not. The Daily Mail isn't what it was. Of course, then it was a giant amongst several giant right-wing newspapers, and there was virtually nothing else.
I honestly do believe that this age of these Lord Rothermeres, these proverbial Citizen Kanes, is over, because if a Zinoviev letter was published today, within 5 minutes people on Twitter and the rest of the social media sphere would be analysing it. Then more forensically minded professionals, as well as deeply informed and intelligent amateurs, would be able to analyse it, and things would get debunked. So I think that one of the interesting lessons from this period in history is, while many Zinoviev letters have been penned since, and are doubtlessly being penned right now,
I'm sure,
their ability to actually have a pervading influence on public opinion in the way that it did in 1924, I think that that bird has flown, which is one of the reasons that the Zinoviev letters of today are getting ever more absurd, where if the Zinoviev letter in 1924 could have been believable by those willing to suspend an element of their belief, the kinds of accusations we hear today are just so absurd it would make the kind of paperback novelists of the 1920s blush with shame.
Well, I've just been writing about it for my RT.com weekly column, and it was only when writing, resuming the smears that Corbyn has faced, for example, that I was reminded again of the sheer scale of them, but also the absurdity of them. Not only, you know, spin and start again, because of course these have been launched many times. Not only has Corbyn been accused of anti-Semitism, but he's been accused of being a Czech spy, an East German spy, a Russian spy, a spy recruited by the KGB in Latin America, though you don't know that yet, that's in a forthcoming biography, or recruited with Diane Abbott on the back of his motorcycle on a motorcycle tour of East Germany, which neither of them ever made, and so on and so on. It is helpful that they do have to go to the margins of absurdity with their allegations now, precisely because social media helps to command the middle ground with its ability to forensically analyze syntax in a way that wasn't possible at the time of the Zinoviev letter. I mean, I now know people who can tell you whether you or I wrote something, whomsoever's name it had been written in, just by analysis of your writing and mine. And that's a very developed skill that computers have made possible, really quite to the level of almost absolute accuracy.
And that is, again, one of the reasons why they're having a more difficult time. Just again to contextualize it with Corbyn and to see how far they've had to go since the days of Ramsay MacDonald. Corbyn, if we were to believe the lies, is the only man in history to simultaneously be a member of the PLO, a member of the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, of Hamas, of Hezbollah, of the KGB, of the Stasi, of the Czech Secret Intelligence Agency, of some closeted non-existent neo-Nazi agency. All of these groups, of course, have contradictory views. And I mean, when you really break it down, it's absolutely absurd. And I do think that people are also, in the case of Corbyn, motivated by a moral element. Whatever one thinks of Corbyn's policies, it's almost impossible not to think of him as a decent man. And even in the areas
At one point, they all conceded that when they wanted to kill him with kindness.
Indeed.
When that became less possible, they had to lurch back to, oh no, he's actually extraordinarily venal, the most venal man who's ever been in the leadership of a British
He doesn't look it
political
or
party.
sound it.
No.
It must all happen in private.
On his allotment.
Yes.
Anyway, I'm taking you too far forward. We're back in 24. MacDonald has fallen. The Tories are in. MacDonald goes on to totally destroy his own reputation. Having won for Labour in 29, he deserts the party, forms a national government with the Tories as the 1930s crisis develops, and is now a forgotten and or reviled figure. Zinoviev goes to his death in the purges in the late 1930s. Some people remember Zinoviev for the letter. I prefer to remember him for the Congress at Baku, the Congress of the Peoples, when he gathered people from all over the world to plan a way forward for the international working class. Others will remember him as a man who begged for his life in the dungeons of the Lubyanka while he was being executed. Take us on then from Zinoviev. Next false flag, please.
Well, we've been to France, we've been to Britain, now it's time to go to the United States. And a man whose name has become an epithet, has become a movement, has come to represent a mentality. And this is, of course, Joseph McCarthy. Now, Joseph McCarthy, contrary to popular mythology, didn't actually invent the idea of commie hunting at a congressional level. That actually happened in the late 1930s when something called HUAC, the House Un-American Activities Committee, was formed to find people within prominent ranks of US society, up to and including the government, who had connections to international communism, as it would have been called then. HUAC became particularly known after the Second World War for going after men and women in Hollywood and blacklisting them. And some of the more famous ones actually include one of my true heroes of filmmaking, and I don't say that a lot, and that's Orson Welles. He was able to just about survive the blacklist by going throughout Europe during the height of HUAC's political insurgency against its own citizens. He spent time in Ireland, in France, in Spain, elsewhere. How ironic that someone accused of being a communist by the American government had to go to fascist Francoist Spain in order to find reprieve. But stranger things in history have happened and will continue to do. McCarthy first entered the US Senate in 1947, and he started his own personal crusade against what he felt was the communist influence. And while HUAC tended to focus a lot on the private sector, with Hollywood being the most famous, McCarthy went after the big boys. He went after the government itself. He went after the US Army. And that ironically proved to be his undoing. When he was interrogated meeting in a senatorial committee a man called Joseph Welch. Welch famously came to the defense of one of his junior lawyers who McCarthy was accusing of being a communist. And the famous line that Welch said to McCarthy was, "Have you no decency?" And that, sir,
have you no
indeed.
decency, sir?
Indeed. And that became a kind of clarion call which began a popular movement against McCarthy, whereas before that he tended to enjoy popularity. We have to remember this was the era of the John Birch Society, which Bob Dylan wrote a well-known song about, where everyone was a communist. The UN was a communist plot. Every mainstream US politician was a communist. War hero Dwight D. Eisenhower had communist sympathies. Literally, if you were to believe these people, there were fewer people that were not communists than were communists, and only John Birchers and people like Joe McCarthy were proper anti-communists. It seems absurd, except if you understand that today, anyone who disagrees with the mainstream liberal political consensus in the West is some sort of Russian agent. So we've gone from tarring everyone with an ideology to tarring everyone under very racist terms, as though even associating with an ethnic Russian is somehow evil.
Well, it's a good point. You know, Dr. Johnson said that the grimmest dictatorship of them all was the dictatorship of the prevailing orthodoxy.
Indeed.
And that's been true throughout history. It's true now. But I made the point yesterday. Whilst for most of my life, because I've lived a long life, I could fairly be accused of being pro-Russian, with the restoration of capitalism in Russia, that ceased to be true. I'm not pro-Russian because I like Russians more than any other people. I treat every group of people as the same, some good, some bad.
Indeed.
Whilst I support President Putin in terms of the war in Syria, the situation in the Ukraine, and some other international issues, I would not myself have voted for him if I'd been a Russian in the Russian election.
I have a feeling I know who you would have voted for.
Yes, your feeling is correct. So it's passing strange, if not deeply offensive, that they Russianize this question. That if you are found eating a Russian dish or listening to a Russian composer or agreeing with the Russian government on this or that issue, you are an agent. You are actually worse than a sympathizer.
Yes.
You're an agent. And that's what today's current witch hunt is all about, isn't it? We've got British agents employed by British state money accusing other people of being Russian agents. Tell us about it.
Well, I think in order to contextualize this, we need to remember the words of Ataturk, who said, "They go as they come." McCarthy entered the stage as a bombastic, unrepentant, unapologetic, almost continually drunk, larger-than-life senator who was willing to accuse anyone and everyone and everything of being a communist plot, including the army, the United States Army. Imagine that. But that's what he insinuated without much innuendo before the Senate. He was eventually censured by the Senate in the late 1950s, which was a pretty big deal. That rarely happens to senators. And it's essentially holding him in contempt, saying, "You've gone far enough, you're embarrassing yourself." And you know it got bad when even some of the people in the anti-communist movement, the people who would want to question you for wearing a red or is it maroon waistcoat, immediately
it's
suspicious.
Maroon, Your Honor.
I was just looking at the it's blue, so I'm safe, but I've been sympathetic to Jeremy Corbyn, so I'm clearly not safe. But people, even in that movement, said this guy is discrediting us by being so bombastic.
So extreme, yeah.
When you start to accuse the waiter who said, "We're out of orange juice, would you like some red tomato juice?" When you start accusing him of being a communist agent, people start to not take anything seriously. And so for every maybe one or two communists or communist sympathizers, which, by the way, it wasn't illegal to be a communist in the United States.
Not then, nor now.
Exactly. So for every one communist, there were 100 people who were defamed, because it was considered a form of defamation then, as it really is now in America. People had enough, and McCarthy failed, and he was ridiculed left and right, whether through innuendo in films like Doctor Strangelove or directly in the music of Bob Dylan and others. He became a figure.
Trumbo, did you see the movie Trumbo?
Indeed.
Which won the Oscar, which was really a very life-affirming movie. I urge everyone to watch it.
I concur.
Trumbo, Trumbo. He was one of the greatest screenwriters of all time, but forced to work under other people's names.
Which is what a lot of them did, yeah.
Share the wages with him. I've got a book somewhere here. I wish I'd laid it out, The Red and the Blacklist. It was by a friend of mine called Norma Barsman, whose husband was a great film director, and he was effectively forced into exile by the witch hunt, the McCarthyite period. They were actually communists, him and her were party members, and they moved to the south of France. As you would, from Hollywood, you'd go to the south of France, and they discovered quite by chance that their next door neighbor was Pablo Picasso, who was also a communist.
Indeed.
And there, my beautiful, clever wife has recovered it. It's this one. I've actually got some for sale, because I actually bought them. Hollywood, The Red and the Blacklist. Norma Barsman. Anyway, this story has a very happy ending. I'm not sure if she puts it in the book, and forgive me, Norma, if I shouldn't say. Picasso gave them a painting which later became very, very valuable indeed. More valuable than anything they would ever have earned in Hollywood in 100 years. So thanks very much to McCarthy.
So a story that began with communism ends in profit.
Ends in capitalist profit, yes, and may Norma live long and well on it. So false flags, there have been by the score, by the hundred, really, even in the 20th century. Not all of them succeeded. Give me one, if you would, that you would describe as having been a success, an enduring success for its perpetrator.
Well, this wasn't a party political false flag, but it was a military false flag. And this is one that we actually touched on previously, the Gulf of Tonkin Bay incident, where the President Lyndon Johnson blamed the North Vietnamese for attacking an American ship, and the entire situation was a fabrication. It, of course, led to the escalation of military advisors from the United States going into Vietnam to a full-scale war, which ended only in 1975 with the ignominious defeat of the United States. An almost exactly similar incident happened before that in the late 19th century. And again, we touched on this before, the sinking of the Maine, an American ship off the coast of Cuba. The yellow media of the time, the Hearsts and the Pulitzers, blamed Spain, when really the explosion in the Maine was due to a faulty boiler or perhaps ignited gunpowder. But the fact remains it was an internal explosion, nothing to do with any external attack. That led to a war, the Spanish-American War, which saw the US conquering the Philippines, conquering Cuba, and conquering Puerto Rico, which is still part of the United States without being a full state. Taxation without representation, one could say.
Didn't Hearst covered that, and didn't he say something about, I'll give you a war? He manufactured a war.
I think the man he was talking to was a man called Bierce, the poet Ambrose Bierce, if memory serves me right. And he said, and when Bierce was essentially saying, you want me to be jingoistic about what? And Hearst retorted, give me the prose poetry and I'll give you the war.
What a wonderful quote. And that's all, unfortunately, that we've got time for this edition of the History Boys. I hope you've enjoyed it, and if you have, do make sure to come back for more.